Imagine a kingdom at the height of its power, where gold was as common as stones on the streets of its capital. A place where the wisest king in history built a temple so magnificent that its stories echoed for millennia. But what happens when wisdom meets temptation? When absolute power corrupts absolutely? The first book of Kings takes us into an epic drama of biblical proportions, where mighty kings rise and fall, prophets challenge monarchs, and the fate of a nation hangs by a thread. From the palace intrigues of Jerusalem to the dramatic confrontations on Mount Carmel, this is a story of choices that altered the course of history. Prepare for a journey through gilded palaces and scorching deserts, where we will witness how Israel's greatest kingdom was divided, how wisdom turned into madness, and how God used unlikely people to change the destiny of entire nations. Our story begins in the final moments of one of Israel's greatest kings, David, the shepherd boy who became king, the warrior who defeated Goliath, the composer of the Psalms, was now reaching the end of his earthly journey. As the first chapter of 1 Kings verses 1 to 4 tells us, David was so old and frail that even when covered with blankets, he could not keep warm. The situation was so dire that his servants came up with an idea: to find a young virgin to serve the king, lie beside him, and keep him warm. After a search throughout Israel, they found Abishag, a young Shunammite of extraordinary beauty, who was brought to the king to care for him and serve him. The biblical text makes a point of stating that, although she cared for the king, David did not have relations with her, a detail that would later become significant in the narrative. This moment of fragility in the great King David shows us how even the most powerful are vulnerable to time. The man who once danced with all his might before the Ark of the Covenant, as recorded in 2 Samuel 6, could now barely keep warm. The warrior who had conquered Jerusalem and expanded Israel's borders was now confined to his chambers, dependent on constant care. Meanwhile, as we read in 1 Kings chapter 1 verses 5 to 10, a power struggle was beginning to unfold behind the palace walls. Adonijah, David's fourth son, born to Haggith in Hebron, saw his father's frailty as an opportunity to seize the throne. The text provides crucial details about his character. He was very handsome, much like his late brother Absalom, and had grown up without ever being disciplined by his father, who had never asked him, "Why do you act this way?" This failure in Adonijah's upbringing reveals a pattern that had already caused problems in David's family before, particularly with his son Absalom. Adonijah was not originally first in line to the throne. Amnon, the eldest, had been killed by Absalom in revenge for Tamar's assault. Chileab, the second son, is not mentioned in the scriptures after his birth, suggesting he likely died young. Absalom, the third son, had died in his own rebellion against his father. Thus, Adonijah saw himself as the natural heir to the throne, even though he knew his father had promised the kingdom to Solomon, Bathsheba's son. To strengthen his position, Adonijah built a powerful base of support. As we see in 1 Kings chapter 1 verses 7 and 8, he gained the backing of two key figures in the kingdom. Joab, son of Zeruiah, the army commander who had faithfully served David for decades, and Abiathar, one of the chief priests who had been with David since his days fleeing from Saul. However, other important leaders did not support his cause. The priest Zadok, the prophet Nathan, Benaiah, one of David's elite warriors, and David's mighty men remained loyal to the king. With these alliances secured, Adonijah organized a grand feast near the stone of Zoheleth by En-Rogel. As recorded in 1 Kings chapter 1 verses 9 and 10, he sacrificed sheep, oxen, and fattened cattle, inviting all his brothers, the king's sons, and all the men of Judah who served the king. Notably, he did not invite three key individuals: his brother Solomon, the prophet Nathan, and David's mighty warriors. This deliberate exclusion made his intentions clear. This was not merely a banquet, but a political statement of his claim to the throne. But God had other plans. The prophet Nathan, the same man who had confronted David after his sin with Bathsheba and who had delivered God's promise of an eternal covenant with David's house, now took action once more. As we see in 1 Kings, chapter 1, verses 11 to 14, he urgently approached Bathsheba. Nathan revealed Adonijah's conspiracy and reminded Bathsheba of David's promise that her son Solomon would be the next king. The plan Nathan proposed demonstrated his political wisdom. Bathsheba was to go first before the king to remind him of his oath, and while she was still speaking, Nathan would enter to confirm her words. The execution of the plan was flawless. As recorded in 1 Kings chapter 1, verses 15 to 21, Bathsheba entered the king's presence, bowed before him, and when asked what she desired, she reminded David of his sworn promise before the Lord, that Solomon, her son, would reign after him and sit on his throne. She then informed him of Adonijah's actions, explaining that he was already proclaiming himself king without David's knowledge. Bathsheba emphasized that all of Israel was looking to the king, awaiting his declaration of who would succeed him. Otherwise, she and Solomon would be treated as criminals as soon as David passed away. Following the plan, while Bathsheba was still speaking to the king, as we read in 1 Kings chapter 1, verses 22 to 27, the prophet Nathan arrived and was announced. He confirmed everything Bathsheba had said, questioning whether this succession had truly been decreed by the king, as Adonijah had already hosted a great feast and was being hailed as king by some. The strategy of double confirmation worked. David was stirred into action. In a moment reminiscent of the David of old, the king acts with decisiveness and authority. As we read in 1 Kings 1:28 to 40, he calls Bathsheba back and reaffirms his oath. As surely as I swore by the Lord, the God of Israel, saying that your son Solomon shall reign after me and sit on my throne in my place, so I will do this very day. Then he summoned Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah son of Jehoiada, giving them specific instructions. They were to take the servants of their lord, have Solomon ride on the king's own mule, a clear symbol of royalty, as no one could use the king's mule without his permission, and lead him to Gihon. There, Zadok and Nathan were to anoint him king over Israel, blow the trumpet and proclaim, "Long live King Solomon." The scene that follows is of great historical and spiritual significance. Solomon is brought to Gihon, anointed with the oil from the tabernacle by Zadok and Nathan. The trumpets sound, and all the people follow, playing flutes and celebrating with such joy that, according to the text, the ground seemed to shake from the noise. This celebration was not merely a festive occasion, but a public confirmation of God's will and the rightful choice of the king. Meanwhile, at Adonijah's banquet, as recounted in 1 Kings 1:41-49, the conspirators hear the sound of the celebrations. Joab, the seasoned commander of the army, recognizes the sound of the trumpet and questions the commotion in the city. At that moment, Jonathan, son of the priest Abiathar, arrives with news. Solomon has been made king with David's blessing, anointed at Gihon, and is now seated on the royal throne, with all the people rejoicing. Moreover, the king's officials have blessed David, saying, "May God make Solomon's name more famous than yours, and his throne greater than your throne." Fear grips the conspirators, and they flee in different directions. Terrified for his life, Adonijah runs to the tabernacle and grasps the horns of the altar, a symbolic act pleading for asylum and mercy. As we read in 1 Kings 1:50-53, when Solomon is informed, he demonstrates his first act of wisdom as king. He promises to spare his brother's life, provided he proves himself trustworthy. If any evil is found in him, he will die. Adonijah is brought before Solomon, bows down to him, and is sent home. But the story does not end there. In his final moments, as recorded in 1 Kings 2:19, David gives his last instructions to Solomon. First, he encourages his son to be strong and prove himself a man, following the ways of the Lord and keeping his statutes, commandments, judgments, and testimonies as written in the law of Moses. David reminds Solomon of the Lord's conditional promise. If his descendants walk in the way of the Lord, faithfully following him with all their heart and soul, David's lineage will never lack a successor on the throne of Israel. Then, demonstrating that there were still unresolved political matters, David gives specific instructions on how to deal with certain individuals. Regarding Joab, son of Zeruiah, David recalls the murders he committed, killing Abner and Amasa during peacetime, shedding the blood of war in a time of peace. Regarding the sons of Barzillai the Gileadite, David asks that they be treated with kindness and allowed to eat at Solomon's table, as they had helped David during his flight from Absalom. Finally, concerning Shimei, son of Gera, who had cursed him terribly on the day he fled from Absalom, David leaves it to Solomon to administer justice. With the kingdom firmly established in his hands, Solomon begins consolidating his power through strategic alliances. As we read in 1 Kings 3:1, he makes an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, by marrying his daughter. This marriage was not merely a personal union, but a powerful declaration of Israel's international status. Pharaoh's daughter was brought to the city of David, where she remained until Solomon completed the construction of his own palace, the house of the Lord, and the walls surrounding Jerusalem. During this early period, as noted in 1 Kings 3:2-4, the people were still offering sacrifices on the high places because, until then, no temple had been built for the name of the Lord. The text tells us that Solomon loved the Lord and walked in the statutes of his father David, yet he also offered sacrifices and burned incense at the high places. The most prominent of these places was Gibeon, considered the greatest high place, where Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on the altar. It was in Gibeon that one of the most significant moments of Solomon's reign took place. As recorded in 1 Kings 3:5-15, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream during the night. In this divine encounter, God made an extraordinary offer to the young king. "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." Solomon's response would reveal much about his character and priorities at that moment. Solomon begins his answer by acknowledging God's kindness toward his father David, who walked in truth, righteousness, and uprightness of heart. He also recognizes that God had shown great mercy by giving David a son to sit on his throne. With humility, Solomon describes himself as a little child who does not know how to go out or come in. He acknowledges the magnitude of the task before him, governing a people so numerous that they cannot be counted. Therefore, his request is striking in its wisdom. "So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong." This response pleased the Lord, as we see in 1 Kings 3:10-14. God commends Solomon for not asking for a long life, riches, or the death of his enemies, but rather for discernment in administering justice. Because of this wise choice, God promises to give Solomon not only a wise and understanding heart, such as had never been seen before him and would never be seen after him, but also what he did not ask for, riches and honor, so that no king would compare to him all his days. Moreover, if Solomon walked in the ways of the Lord, keeping his statutes and commandments as David did, God would also grant him a long life. When Solomon awoke, he realized it had been a dream. He returned to Jerusalem, presented himself before the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, offered burnt offerings and peace sacrifices, and held a feast for all his servants. The wisdom promised by God would soon manifest. As recorded in 1 Kings 3:16-28, 2 women who were prostitutes soon came before the king. A complex situation was presented. They lived in the same house and had given birth 3 days apart. During the night, one of them accidentally lay on her baby, causing his death. This woman then switched the babies, placing the dead child next to the other woman and taking the living baby as her own. In the morning, when the second woman woke up to nurse her son, she discovered that the dead baby was not hers. Now, both women were disputing the maternity of the living child before the king. Solomon's proposed solution would reveal his extraordinary wisdom. After hearing both women present their versions, seemingly impossible to verify, the king called for a sword and ordered, "Cut the living child in two and give half to one and half to the other." The reaction of the two women exposed the truth. The real mother, moved by love and compassion, begged for the baby to be given to the other woman, preferring to see her son in another's hands rather than see him killed. The false mother, on the other hand, agreed to the division, saying, "He shall be neither mine nor yours, divide him." Solomon then revealed his strategy, ordering that the living child be given to the first woman, recognizing her as the true mother. This judgment had a profound impact throughout Israel. As recorded in 1 Kings 3:28, all the people heard of the sentence the king had rendered and feared him because they saw that he had the wisdom of God to administer justice. Chapter 4 of 1 Kings provides a detailed overview of the kingdom's administration under Solomon. In verses 1-6, we find a list of the kingdom's chief officials. Azariah, son of Zadok, was the priest. Elihoreph and Ahijah were secretaries. Jehoshaphat was the recorder. Benaiah commanded the army. Zadok and Abiathar were priests. Azariah oversaw the governors. Zabud was the king's friend. Ahisha managed the royal household, and Adoniram supervised forced labor. The administrative organization of the kingdom was impressive. As we read in 1 Kings 4:7-19, Solomon had 12 governors over all of Israel, responsible for supplying provisions for the king and his household. Each governor was required to provide provisions for 1 month of the year. This structure ensured a constant flow of resources to sustain the growing royal court. The extent and prosperity of Solomon's kingdom are described in 1 Kings 4:20-28. The text states that Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand on the seashore, eating, drinking, and rejoicing. Solomon's dominion extended over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates River to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. These kingdoms brought tributes and served Solomon all the days of his life. The daily consumption at the palace was immense. 30 cors of fine flour, 60 cors of meal, 10 fattened oxen, 20 pasture-fed oxen, 100 sheep, as well as deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fattened fowl. For the horses and camels, 40,000 stalls for chariot. Horses and 12,000 horsemen were required. Solomon's wisdom, as promised by God, surpassed that of all others. In 1 Kings 4:29-34, we read that God gave Solomon wisdom, great understanding, and a breadth of knowledge as vast as the sand on the seashore. His wisdom exceeded that of all the people of the East and all the knowledge of Egypt. He was wiser than anyone, including Ethan the Ezrahite and Heman, Calcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahol. His fame spread throughout all the surrounding nations. The text tells us that Solomon spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. He discoursed on plants, from the cedar in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of walls, as well as on animals, birds, reptiles, and fish. People from all nations came to hear Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the earth who had heard of his knowledge. With his reputation established and his kingdom flourishing, Solomon was ready to embark on his greatest project, the construction of the Lord's temple. The time of worship in the high places was coming to an end, and a new era in Israel's history was about to begin. With his kingdom firmly established and prosperous, Solomon decided to undertake the grand task of building a house for the name of the Lord, fulfilling the desire that had been in his father David's heart. As recorded in 1 Kings 5:1-6, Solomon sent messengers to Hiram, king of Tyre, reminding him of his past friendship with David. He explained that David had been unable to build a house for the name of the Lord because of the wars that surrounded him, but now, with peace secured, the time had come. Solomon's request to Hiram was specific. He needed the famous cedars of Lebanon, as there was no one in Israel skilled in cutting timber like the Sidonians. In 1 Kings 5:7-12, we see that Hiram was very pleased to receive this message, blessing the Lord for giving David a wise son to rule such a great people. Hiram's response was favorable. He would supply both cedars and cypresses, transporting them in rafts by sea to the location Solomon designated. In exchange, Solomon would provide wheat and pure olive oil for Hiram's household. This commercial alliance and peace treaty between the two kings would be fundamental to the construction of the temple. The mobilization of workers for this grand project was remarkable. As recorded in 1 Kings 5:13-18, Solomon conscripted laborers from all over Israel, 30,000 men, working in monthly shifts of 10,000 in Lebanon. Additionally, 70,000 men transported loads, 80,000 cut stones in the mountains, and 3,300 supervisors directed the workforce. By the king's command, large, carefully chosen and hewn stones were cut to lay the foundation of the temple with precision-crafted masonry. The actual construction began, as stated in 1 Kings 6:1, in the 480th year after the Israelites had come out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month. The dimensions of the temple are detailed in 1 Kings 6:2-10, 60 cubits in length, 20 cubits in width, and 30 cubits in height. The portico in front of the temple was 20 cubits long and 10 cubits wide. The windows were broad on the inside and narrow on the outside. The structure of the temple was both complex and magnificent. Against the wall, there were surrounding levels with side chambers. The lowest level was 5 cubits wide, the middle level was 6 cubits wide, and the third level was 7 cubits wide. The stones used for construction were pre-cut at the quarry, so no hammer, axe, or any iron tool was heard during the building of the house, as mentioned in 1 Kings 6:7. The interior of the temple received special attention, as described in 1 Kings 6:14-22. All the inner walls were lined with cedar from the floor to the ceiling, and the floor was covered with cypress boards. The 20 cubits at the rear were partitioned off with cedar boards to form the most holy place. The entire interior was overlaid with pure gold, and a cedar altar was placed before the sanctuary, also overlaid with gold. In the most holy place, as stated in 1 Kings 6:23-28, 2 cherubim made of olive wood were placed, each 10 cubits high. The cherubim's wings stretched so that one wing of one cherub touched one wall, while the wing of the other cherub touched the opposite wall, and their other wings met in the middle of the house. The cherubim were also overlaid with gold. The walls of the temple were adorned with embossed decorations, cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers, all overlaid with gold, as described in 1 Kings 6:29-35. The doors were made of olive wood, with cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers carved into them, all covered with hammered gold. The inner courtyard was constructed with 3 rows of dressed stone and 1 row of cedar beams. The construction of the temple took 7 years, as recorded in 1 Kings 6:38. It was begun in the month of Ziv and completed in the month of Bul, the 8th month, in the 11th year of Solomon's reign. But Solomon did not only build the temple. As stated in 1 Kings 7:1-12, he also built his own palace, which took 13 years to complete. The royal palace included the house of the forest of Lebanon, measuring 100 cubits in length, 50 cubits in width, and 30 cubits in height, supported by 4 rows of cedar columns. There was also the Hall of Pillars, the Hall of the Throne where he judged, and a house for Pharaoh's daughter, whom Solomon had married. For the more specialized work, as recorded in 1 Kings 7:13-14, Solomon brought a man from Tyre named Hiram, different from the king of Tyre, the son of a widow from the tribe of Naphtali and a Tyrian father. This Hiram was filled with wisdom, understanding and knowledge to carry out all kinds of bronze work. Hiram's bronze work was extraordinary. In 1 Kings 7:15-47, detailed descriptions of his creations are found. 2 bronze columns, each 18 cubits high, named Jachin and Boaz, with ornamented capitals at the top. The Molten Sea, a large circular basin 10 cubits in diameter, supported by 12 bronze oxen. 10 movable bronze stands with wheels, each 4 cubits in length, width, and height, and 10 bronze basins, 1 on each stand. Additionally, he made shovels, basins, and all the necessary utensils for the service of the temple. The amount of bronze used was so vast that, as noted in 1 Kings 7:47, Solomon stopped weighing it because it was beyond measure. All these items were cast in the clay ground of the Jordan plain between Succoth and Zarethan. The gold objects were also numerous and precious. As recorded in 1 Kings 7:48-50, Solomon made all the furnishings for the house of the Lord: the golden altar, the golden table for the showbread, the pure gold lampstands, 5 on the right and 5 on the left before the sanctuary, the flowers, lamps, and tongs of gold, the cups, wick trimmers, basins, ladles, and censers of pure gold. Even the hinges for the doors of the inner house and the temple were made of gold. Thus, all the work that King Solomon had done for the house of the Lord was completed. As mentioned in 1 Kings 7:51, Solomon brought in the things his father David had dedicated, the silver, the gold, and the utensils, and placed them in the treasuries of the house of the Lord. The magnitude of this construction was unprecedented in Israel. The temple was not merely a religious building, but a symbol of Solomon's power and glory, and most importantly, of God's presence among his people. Now, everything was ready for the most significant moment, the dedication of the temple and the transfer of the Ark of the Covenant to its new home. With the temple completed, it was time to move the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord to its new dwelling place. As stated in 1 Kings 8:1-2, Solomon summoned to Jerusalem all the elders of Israel, the heads of the tribes, and the leaders of the Israelite families. They gathered in the month of Ethanim, the 7th month during the festival, signifying the religious and national importance of this moment. The procession to transport the ark was majestic. As recorded in 1 Kings 8:3-9, all the elders of Israel came, and the priests lifted the ark. They brought the ark of the Lord, the tent of meeting, and all the sacred furnishings that were in the tent. The priests and Levites carried them, while King Solomon and the entire congregation of Israel who had assembled before the ark walked ahead, sacrificing so many sheep and cattle that they could not be counted. The ark contained only the 2 stone tablets that Moses had placed there at Horeb when the Lord made a covenant with the Israelites after they came out of the land of Egypt. The moment the ark entered the temple was marked by a supernatural event. As we read in 1 Kings 8:10-11, when the priests came out of the sanctuary, a cloud filled the house of the Lord. The priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord had filled the house of the Lord. This visible manifestation of the divine presence, known as the Shekinah, was a clear sign of God's approval. In response to this divine demonstration, Solomon spoke profound words, recorded in 1 Kings 8:12-13. The Lord said that he would dwell in thick darkness. I have indeed built you a house to dwell in, a place for your eternal habitation. Then turning to the entire congregation of Israel, who were standing, Solomon began to offer one of the most significant prayers in the Old Testament. Solomon's prayer of dedication, found in 1 Kings 8:15-53, is one of the deepest and theologically richest texts in Scripture. He begins by blessing the Lord, the God of Israel, who had fulfilled with his own hands what he had promised to David, his father. Solomon acknowledges that although since the day he brought his people out of Egypt, God had not chosen any city to build a house for his name, he had chosen David to rule over his people. In his prayer, Solomon recognizes the greatness and transcendence of God. As seen in 1 Kings 8:27-30, he admits that even the heavens and the highest heavens cannot contain God, much less the house he had built. Nevertheless, he asks that the Lord's eyes be open day and night toward that house, the place of which he had said his name would be there. He pleads for God to hear the prayers offered in that place. The prayer then unfolds into 7 specific situations in which the people would seek God in the temple. In 1 Kings 8:31-32, he speaks of cases of oaths between individuals. In verses 33-34, he addresses situations in which Israel might be defeated by enemies because of their sins. In verses 35-36, he mentions periods of drought due to the people's transgressions. In verses 37-40, he speaks of famine, pestilence, blight, crop diseases, and sickness. In verses 41-43, he intercedes for foreigners who would come to pray in the temple. In verses 44-45, he prays for the people when they go out to war. And in verses 46-53, he considers the possibility of exile when the people might sin and be taken captive to a foreign land. After this comprehensive prayer, Solomon arose from before the altar of the Lord, where he had been kneeling with his hands spread toward heaven, and stood up. As recorded in 1 Kings 8:54-61, he blessed the entire congregation of Israel in a loud voice, asking that the Lord be with them as he had been with their ancestors, inclining the hearts of the people to walk in all his ways and keep his commandments, statutes, and judgments. The dedication of the temple was marked by extraordinary sacrifices. As we read in 1 Kings 8:62-64, the king and all Israel with him offered sacrifices before the Lord, 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep. On the same day the king consecrated the middle of the courtyard in front of the house of the Lord, for there he offered burnt offerings, grain offerings, and the fat of the peace offerings, since the bronze altar was too small to contain all the sacrifices. The celebration lasted a total of 14 days, as recorded in 1 Kings 8:65-66, 7 days for the dedication of the altar, and another 7 days for the Feast of Tabernacles. On the 8th day, Solomon dismissed the people, who blessed the king and went to their tents, joyful and glad of heart, for all the goodness that the Lord had shown to David, his servant, and to Israel, his people. After the dedication of the temple, the Lord appeared to Solomon for the second time, as he had appeared to him in Gibeon. In 1 Kings 9:3-9, God confirmed that he had heard Solomon's prayer and sanctified the house he had built. The Lord's eyes and heart would be there every day. However, this promise came with a serious warning. If Solomon or his descendants turned away from following God and served other gods, then Israel would be cut off from the land, the temple would be destroyed, and it would become an object of ridicule among the nations. The power and prosperity of Solomon's kingdom continued to grow. As we read in 1 Kings 9:10-14, at the end of 20 years, during which Solomon built the 2 houses, the house of the Lord and the king's house, Hiram, king of Tyre, having supplied Solomon with cedar, cypress, and gold, according to all his desire, received in exchange 20 cities in the land of Galilee. However, when Hiram came from Tyre to inspect the cities, he was not pleased with them and called them the land of Kabul, a name that remains to this day. Solomon's construction projects were extensive, As recorded in 1 Kings 9:15-19, he built the Millo and the wall of Jerusalem, as well as Hazor, Megiddo, and Gaza. The latter had been captured and burned by Pharaoh, king of Egypt, who gave it as a dowry to his daughter, Solomon's wife. Solomon also built Lower Beth Horon, Baalath, Tadmor, in the wilderness, all his store cities, the cities for his chariots, the cities for his horsemen, and whatever he desired to build in Jerusalem, Lebanon, and throughout his domain. The organization of forced labor is also described in 1 Kings 9:20-23. All the remaining people of the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, who were not Israelites, were subjected to forced labor by Solomon. However, Solomon did not enslave any of the Israelites. Instead, they served as warriors, officials, commanders, captains, and overseers of his chariots and horsemen. The fame of Solomon spread throughout the region, attracting distinguished visitors. The most famous of these was the Queen of Sheba. As told in 1 Kings 10:1-5, having heard of Solomon's renown, she came to test him with difficult questions. She arrived in Jerusalem with a great entourage, bringing camels laden with spices, an abundance of gold, and precious stones. When she met Solomon, she spoke to him about everything in her heart, and Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing the king could not explain to her. The Queen of Sheba was impressed not only by Solomon's wisdom, but also by everything she saw. As recorded in 1 Kings 10:6-9, she declared that not even half of what she had heard did justice to the reality. Solomon's wisdom and prosperity far exceeded the report she had received. She considered Solomon's men and servants fortunate as they stood continually in his presence and listened to his wisdom. She praised the Lord, the God of Israel, who had placed Solomon on the throne. The wealth of Solomon's kingdom was extraordinary. In 1 Kings 10:14-22, we learn that the weight of gold brought to Solomon each year was 666 talents, in addition to revenues from merchants, traders, all the kings of Arabia, and the governors of the land. The king made 200 large shields of hammered gold and 300 smaller shields, which were placed in the house of the forest of Lebanon. His throne was made of ivory and overlaid with pure gold, featuring 6 steps and 12 lions, one on each side of every step. All of the king's drinking vessels were made of gold, and every object in the house of the forest of Lebanon was pure gold. Silver was considered of no value in Solomon's time. The kingdom's commercial prosperity was also remarkable. As we read in 1 Kings 10:23-29, King Solomon surpassed all the kings of the earth in both wealth and wisdom. He had a fleet of Tarshish ships sailing the seas alongside Hiram's fleet, bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks every 3 years. His merchants imported horses from Egypt and various other regions. The whole world sought an audience with Solomon to hear the wisdom that God had placed in his heart. Each visitor brought gifts, silver and gold objects, garments, armor, spices, horses, and mules. Silver became as common in Jerusalem as stones, and cedar as abundant as the sycamore trees in the lowlands. Despite all his wisdom and the divine blessings he had received, Solomon began to stray from the ways of the Lord. As told in 1 Kings 11:1-3, the king loved many foreign women in addition to Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites, people of whom the Lord had warned the Israelites, saying, "You must not intermarry with them, nor they with you, for surely they will turn your hearts after their gods." Yet Solomon clung to these women in love. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives led his heart astray. The spiritual impact of these unions was devastating. As we read in 1 Kings 11:4-8, when Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart toward other gods, and his heart was no longer fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of his father David had been. Solomon followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. He did evil in the sight of the Lord and did not follow him fully as David had done. He even built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of the Moabites, on the hill east of Jerusalem, and for Moloch, the abomination of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. Divine judgment did not delay. In 1 Kings 11:9-13, we see that the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although God had explicitly commanded him not to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep what the Lord had commanded. Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, "Since this has been your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and decrees, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. However, for the sake of your father, David, I will not do this during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son, yet I will not tear the whole kingdom away. I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen." Divine judgment began to manifest through the rise of adversaries. As recorded in 1 Kings 11:14-22, the Lord raised up an adversary against Solomon, Hadad the Edomite, from the royal line of Edom. During David's reign, when Joab went to bury the dead and struck down all the men in Edom, Hadad, then just a boy, fled to Egypt with some Edomite servants. Pharaoh not only welcomed him, but also provided him with a house, land, and provisions. Hadad gained so much favor that Pharaoh gave him in marriage the sister of his own wife, Queen Tahpenes. When Hadad heard in Egypt that David had rested with his ancestors and that Joab, the commander of the army, was dead, he requested permission from Pharaoh to return to his homeland, becoming an enemy of Israel. Another adversary was Rezin, son of Eliada, as told in 1 Kings 11:23-25. He had fled from his master Hadadezer, king of Zobah, and gathered men around him, becoming the leader of a band of rebels when David defeated them. He went to Damascus, where he reigned and remained a persistent enemy of Israel throughout Solomon's reign, just as Hadad did. He despised Israel and ruled over Aram. But the most significant adversary arose from within the kingdom itself. In 1 Kings 11:26-28, we are introduced to Jeroboam, son of Nebat, an Ephraimite from Zeredah and a servant of Solomon. His mother, Zeruiah, was a widow. He was a strong and capable man, and when Solomon saw how industrious he was, he appointed him over the entire labor force of the house of Joseph, that is, the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. The divine calling of Jeroboam is described in 1 Kings 11:29-39. At that time, when Jeroboam was leaving Jerusalem, the prophet Ahijah the Shilonite met him along the way. Ahijah was wearing a new cloak, and the two were alone in the field. The prophet took the new cloak he was wearing and tore it into 12 pieces. Then he said to Jeroboam, "Take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, See, I am tearing the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and giving you 10 tribes. He will have one tribe for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel." The prophet explained that this would happen because they had abandoned the Lord and worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Milcom, the god of the Ammonites. They had not walked in the ways of the Lord to do what was right in his eyes, as David had done. However, God would not take the entire kingdom from Solomon's hand, but would allow him to remain as prince all the days of his life for the sake of David. Yet from Solomon's son, God would take the kingdom and give 10 tribes to Jeroboam. To his son, he would give 1 tribe so that David, his servant, would always have a lamp before the Lord in Jerusalem, the city he had chosen to place his name there. The Lord promised Jeroboam that if he walked in all his ways, doing what was right in his sight, keeping his statutes and commandments as David had done, he would be with him, build him a lasting dynasty as he had built for David, and give Israel to him. God would humble David's descendants because of their idolatry, but not forever. When Solomon learned of this prophecy, as recorded in 1 Kings 11:40, he sought to kill Jeroboam. But Jeroboam fled to Egypt, to Shishak, king of Egypt, and remained there until Solomon's death. The end of Solomon's reign is briefly described in 1 Kings 11:41-43. The rest of Solomon's acts, all he did, and his wisdom are written in the book of the Acts of Solomon. He reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel for 40 years. Then he rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David, his father. His son Rehoboam reigned in his place. However, the succession would not be peaceful. As we read in 1 Kings 12:1-5, Rehoboam went to Shechem because all Israel had gathered there to make him king. When Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who was still in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon, heard this, he returned from Egypt. They sent for him, and Jeroboam, along with the whole assembly of Israel, came to speak with Rehoboam, saying, "Your father placed a heavy yoke on us. Now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he imposed on us, and we will serve you." Rehoboam answered, "Go away for 3 days, then come back to me." So the people left. During these 3 days, as recorded in 1 Kings 12:6-11, Rehoboam sought 2 very different sources of counsel. First, he consulted the elders who had served his father Solomon while he was alive. They advised him, "If today you will be a servant to these people and serve them, and if you speak to them with kind words, they will be your servants forever." However, Rehoboam rejected this advice and consulted the young men who had grown up with him. They advised him to respond harshly to the people. "My father made your yoke heavy, but I will make it even heavier. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions." The decisive moment came when, as we read in 1 Kings 12:12-15, Jeroboam and all the people returned on the 3rd day, as the king had instructed. The king answered the people harshly, rejecting the advice the elders had given him. Instead, he spoke according to the advice of the young men, saying, "My father made your yoke heavy, but I will make it even heavier. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions." The text tells us that the king did not listen to the people because this turn of events was from the Lord, to fulfill the word he had spoken through Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam, son of Nebat. The people's response was immediate. As recorded in 1 Kings 12:16-20, when all Israel saw that the king refused to listen to them, they answered, "What share do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, Israel. Look after your own house, David." So the Israelites went home. Rehoboam continued to reign only over the Israelites who lived in the cities of Judah. When he sent out Adoram, who was in charge of forced labor, all Israel stoned him to death. King Rehoboam, however, managed to escape to his chariot and flee to Jerusalem. So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. When all Israel heard that Jeroboam had returned, they sent for him, made him king over all Israel, and only the tribe of Judah remained loyal to the house of David. With the kingdom divided, Rehoboam's first actions demonstrated his inexperience as a ruler. As we read in 1 Kings 12:21-24, when he arrived in Jerusalem, he gathered the entire house of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, 180,000 chosen warriors, to fight against the house of Israel and restore the kingdom to Rehoboam, son of Solomon. However, the word of God came to Shemaiah, the man of God, instructing them not to go up or fight against their brothers, the Israelites, but to return home, for this event was from the Lord. They obeyed the word of the Lord and went home as he had commanded. Meanwhile, in the northern kingdom, Jeroboam began establishing his rule. As recorded in 1 Kings 12:25-27, he built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there. Then he went out from there and built Peniel. However, Jeroboam soon became politically anxious. He thought to himself, "Now the kingdom may return to the house of David. If these people go up to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, their hearts will turn back to their lord, Rehoboam, king of Judah. They will kill me and return to Rehoboam, king of Judah." This concern led Jeroboam to make a decision that would forever change the spiritual course of the northern kingdom. As we read in 1 Kings 12:28-33, after seeking counsel, he made 2 golden calves and said to the people, "It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." He placed one in Bethel and the other in Dan. This act became a sin, for the people went as far as Dan to worship before one of the calves. But Jeroboam did not stop there. He also built shrines on the high places and appointed priests from among the people who were not from the sons of Levi. He instituted a festival on the 15th day of the 8th month, similar to the festival celebrated in Judah, and offered sacrifices on the altar. He did the same in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves he had made, and he also appointed priests for the high places he had established there. On the 15th day of the 8th month, the month he had chosen in his own heart, he went up to the altar in Bethel and burned incense, thus holding a feast for the people of Israel. The divine response to this apostasy was swift. As recorded in 1 Kings 13:1-6, a man of God came from Judah to Bethel by the word of the Lord, just as Jeroboam was standing by the altar to burn incense. By the word of the Lord, he cried out against the altar, "Altar, altar, this is what the Lord says. A son named Josiah will be born to the house of David. He will sacrifice on you the priests of the high places who burn incense on you, and human bones will be burned on you." That same day he gave a sign, saying, "This is the sign that the Lord has spoken. The altar will be split apart, and the ashes on it will be poured out." When King Jeroboam heard the word that the man of God had proclaimed against the altar, he stretched out his hand from the altar and said, "Seize him." But the hand he stretched out against the man withered, and he could not pull it back. The altar was split apart and its ashes poured out, just as the man of God had prophesied by the word of the Lord. Then the king pleaded with the man of God to intercede with the Lord his God and pray for him, so that his hand might be restored. The man of God prayed to the Lord, and the king's hand was restored and became as it was before. The story of this man of God continues in 1 Kings 13:7-32 with a tragic ending. Though he initially refused the king's invitation to eat and drink, remaining faithful to God's command not to eat bread or drink water in that place, he was deceived by an old prophet from Bethel. This prophet lied, claiming that an angel had spoken to him by the word of the Lord, instructing him to bring the man of God back. Because he disobeyed the Lord's command, the man of God was killed by a lion on the way. Despite these signs, as 1 Kings 13:33 tells us, Jeroboam did not turn from his evil ways. Instead, he continued appointing priests for the high places from among the lowest of the people. Anyone who wanted to become a priest, he would consecrate. In 1 Kings 14:1-18, we see the consequences of this stubbornness when his son, Abijah, became ill. Jeroboam told his wife to disguise herself and go to Shiloh to consult the prophet Ahijah, the same prophet who had foretold that Jeroboam would become king over Israel. Although the prophet was blind due to old age, the Lord revealed to him that Jeroboam's wife was coming. He delivered a severe message. Because of Jeroboam's idolatry, the Lord would bring disaster upon his house, wiping out every male descendant of Jeroboam. His son would die and would be the only one of Jeroboam's household to receive a proper burial, because in him alone was found something pleasing to the Lord. The divine judgment on the northern kingdom is declared in 1 Kings 14:15-16. The Lord would strike Israel, making it like a reed swaying in the water. He would uproot Israel from the good land he had given to their ancestors and scatter them beyond the river because they had provoked him to anger by making Asherah poles. The Lord would give up Israel because of the sins of Jeroboam, which he committed and caused Israel to commit. In Judah, the spiritual situation was also dire. As recorded in 1 Kings 14:21-24, Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, reigned over Judah. He was 41 years old when he began to reign, and he ruled for 17 years in Jerusalem. Judah did evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to jealousy with their sins more than their ancestors had done. They built high places, sacred pillars, and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every spreading tree. There were also male shrine prostitutes in the land, following the detestable practices of the nations that the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. Judgment was not delayed. As we read in 1 Kings 14:25-28, in the 5th year of King Rehoboam, Shishak, king of Egypt, attacked Jerusalem. He took the treasures of the house of the Lord and the royal palace. He seized everything, including the gold shields that Solomon had made. In their place, King Rehoboam made bronze shields and assigned them to the officers of the guard who protected the entrance to the royal palace. After Rehoboam's death, as recorded in 1 Kings 15:1-8, his son Abijah reigned over Judah. He followed all the sins his father had committed before him. His heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David, his ancestor, had been. Nevertheless, for David's sake, the Lord gave him a lamp in Jerusalem by raising up his son after him and establishing Jerusalem. There was war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam throughout their reigns, and also between Abijah and Jeroboam. In the northern kingdom, after Jeroboam's death, his son Nadab began to reign over Israel, as we read in 1 Kings 15:25-31. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, walking in the ways of his father and in the sin that he had caused Israel to commit. Baasha, the son of Ahijah from the house of Issachar, conspired against him and struck him down at Gibbethon, which belonged to the Philistines, while Nadab and all Israel were besieging the city. Baasha killed him in the 3rd year of Asa, king of Judah, and reigned in his place. As soon as he became king, he struck down the entire house of Jeroboam, leaving no survivor, thus fulfilling the word of the Lord spoken through his servant Ahijah the Shilonite. The reign of Baasha is described in the 1 Kings 15:33-34. He began to reign over all Israel in Tirzah in the 3rd year of Asa, king of Judah, and ruled for 24 years. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and walked in the way of Jeroboam, committing the same sin by which he had caused Israel to sin. In 1 Kings 16:1-7, we see that the word of the Lord came to Jehu, son of Hanani, against Baasha, declaring that since he had followed the ways of Jeroboam, the Lord would completely destroy him, making his house like the house of Jeroboam. This prophecy was fulfilled through his son Elah, who reigned in his place. As recorded in 1 Kings 16:8-14, Elah began to reign over Israel in Tirzah in the 26th year of Asa, king of Judah, and ruled for 2 years. His servant Zimri, commander of half his chariots, conspired against him while he was drunk in Tirzah at the house of Asa, who was in charge of the household in Tirzah. Zimri entered, struck him down, and killed him in the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, and reigned in his place. As soon as he began to reign and took his seat on the throne, he struck down the entire house of Baasha, leaving no male survivor, neither relatives nor friends. Zimri's reign, however, was extremely brief. As we read in 1 Kings 16:15-20, he ruled for only 7 days in Tirzah. The people were camped against Gibbethon, which belonged to the Philistines. When they heard that Zimri had conspired and killed The king, all Israel, made Omri, the commander of the army, king over Israel that very day in the camp. Omri and all Israel went up from Gibbethon and besieged Tirzah. When Zimri saw that the city had been taken, he entered the palace of the king's house, set it on fire around him, and died. A civil war followed, as recorded in 1 Kings 16:21-22. The people of Israel were divided into two factions. Half followed Tibni, son of Ginath, to make him king, and the other half followed Omri. But the people who followed Omri prevailed over those who followed Tibni, son of Ginath. So Tibni died, and Omri reigned. Omri's reign marked a new phase in the history of the northern kingdom. As we learn from 1 Kings 16:23-28, he began to reign over Israel in the 31st year of Asa, king of Judah, and ruled for 12 years. He reigned in Tirzah for 6 years. Then he bought the hill of Samaria from Shema for 2 talents of silver, built on the hill, and named the city he had built Samaria, after Shema, the former owner of the hill. Omri did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, acting more wickedly than all who were before him. He followed all the ways of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, and in his sins, by which he led Israel to sin. After Omri, his son Ahab became king, as recorded in 1 Kings 16:29-33. Ahab began to reign over Israel in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, and ruled for 22 years in Samaria. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, more than all who were before him. As if it were a trivial thing to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, he also took Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, as his wife, and went to serve and worship Baal. He built an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he had constructed in Samaria, and made an Asherah pole. Ahab did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. During his reign, as mentioned in 1 Kings 16:34, Heel the Bethelite rebuilt Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn, Abiram, he laid its foundations, and at the cost of his youngest son, Segub, he set up its gates, in accordance with the word of the Lord, spoken through Joshua, son of Nun. The stage was set for the emergence of one of Israel's greatest prophets, Elijah the Tishbite. In one of the darkest moments in Israel's spiritual history, one of the most remarkable figures of the Old Testament arose. As we read in 1 Kings 17:1, Elijah the Tishbite, from among the inhabitants of Gilead, presented himself before Ahab with a bold declaration, "As surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, there will be neither dew nor rain in these years, except at my word." This was not merely a weather forecast, but a direct challenge to the worship of Baal, who was regarded as the god of rain and fertility. Immediately after this declaration, as we read in 1 Kings 17:2-6, the word of the Lord came to Elijah, instructing him to hide by the brook Cherith east of the Jordan. There he would drink from the brook, and the Lord had commanded ravens to sustain him there. Elijah obeyed the word of the Lord, and the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. This period of isolation served as preparation for Elijah, but it did not last forever. As recorded in 1 Kings 17:7-9, after some time the brook dried up, because there had been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, instructing him to go to Zarephath, which belonged to Sidon, and stay there, for the Lord had commanded a widow to provide for him. The encounter with the widow of Zarephath is one of the most striking episodes in Elijah's ministry. As we read in 1 Kings 17:10-16, when he arrived at the city gate, he found a widow gathering sticks. He asked her for water and a piece of bread. The woman replied that she only had a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug, and was gathering sticks to prepare a final meal for herself and her son before they died of hunger. Elijah told her not to fear, but to first make a small loaf for him. Then prepare food for herself and her son, for thus said the Lord, the jar of flour would not be used up, and the jug of oil would not run dry until the day the Lord sent rain upon the land. The woman did as Elijah had said, and she, Elijah, and her household ate for many days. The jar of flour was not exhausted, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in accordance with the word of the Lord spoken through Elijah. But the widow's faith would be tested even more deeply. As we read in 1 Kings 17:24, after these things, the woman's son, the mistress of the house, became ill, and his illness was so severe that there was no breath left in him. The woman questioned Elijah, asking if he had come to bring her sins to remembrance and to kill her son. Elijah took the boy from her arms, carried him to the room where he was staying, and laid him on his bed. He cried out to the Lord 3 times, stretching himself over the boy, and the Lord heard Elijah's voice. The boy's soul returned to him, and he revived. This miracle confirmed to the woman that Elijah was a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in his mouth was truth. After 3 years of drought, as recorded in 1 Kings 18:1-6, the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year, instructing him to present himself to Ahab, for the Lord would send rain upon the land. The famine was severe in Samaria, and Ahab had summoned Obadiah, the steward of his house, who greatly feared the Lord and had hidden 100 prophets of the Lord, 50 in each cave, when Jezebel was killing the Lord's prophets, to search for water sources and pastures to save the horses and mules. The meeting between Elijah and Obadiah, described in 1 Kings 18:7-15, reveals the tense atmosphere of the time. When Obadiah met Elijah, he bowed down and questioned if it was really him. Elijah asked him to announce his presence to Ahab, but Obadiah was afraid, explaining that Ahab had searched for Elijah in every nation and kingdom, and he feared that after delivering the message, the Spirit of the Lord would take Elijah elsewhere, leading to his own death. The confrontation with Ahab finally took place. As told in 1 Kings 18:16-19, when Ahab saw Elijah, he said, "Is that you, O troubler of Israel?" Elijah replied that he was not the one troubling Israel, but rather Ahab and his father's house, for they had abandoned the Lord's commandments and followed the Baals. Then Elijah proposed a challenge to gather all of Israel at Mount Carmel, along with the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who ate at Jezebel's table. The showdown on Mount Carmel is one of the most dramatic moments in Scripture. As recorded in 1 Kings 18:20-24, Ahab summoned all the Israelites and gathered the prophets on Mount Carmel. Elijah approached the people and said, "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal is, follow him." But the people said nothing. Then Elijah proposed a test. 2 bulls would be prepared, one for Baal's prophets and one for him. Each group would prepare its sacrifice, but put no fire to it. The God who answered by fire, he would be God. Details of the confrontation are narrated in 1 Kings 18:25-29. The prophets of Baal prepared their sacrifice and cried out to Baal from morning until noon, "O Baal, answer us!" But there was no voice, no answer. They danced around the altar they had made. At noon, Elijah mocked them, saying they should cry out louder. Perhaps their God was deep in thought, busy, traveling, or even sleeping. They shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and lances, as was their custom, until their blood gushed out. They continued their frantic prophesying until the time of the evening sacrifice, but there was no voice, no response, no attention. Then it was Elijah's turn. As we read in 1 Kings 18:30-35, he called all the people to come closer and repaired the altar of the Lord that had been broken down. He took 12 stones, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, and with them he built an altar in the name of the Lord. He dug a trench around the altar, arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the wood. Then he instructed them to fill 4 jars with water and pour it over the burnt offering and the wood. He did this 3 times until the water ran around the altar and even filled the trench. Elijah's prayer, recorded in 1 Kings 18:36-37, was simple and direct. Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so that these people may know that you, Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back again. The response was immediate and dramatic. As told in 1 Kings 18:38-39, fire fell from the Lord and consumed the burnt offering, the wood, the stones, and the dust, and even licked up the water in the trench. Seeing this, all the people fell face down and said, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." The victory was complete but also severe. In 1 Kings 18:40, Elijah ordered that the prophets of Baal be seized, and none escaped. They were taken to the Kishon Valley, where they were executed. After this dramatic display of God's power, it was time for the promised rain. As recorded in 1 Kings 18:41-46, Elijah told Ahab to go up, eat and drink, for there was the sound of a heavy rain. While Ahab went up to eat and drink, Elijah climbed to the top of Mount Carmel, bent down to the ground, and put his face between his knees. He told his servant to look toward the sea. The servant looked 7 times, and on the 7th time he reported seeing a small cloud, as small as a man's hand, rising from the sea. Elijah sent word to Ahab to prepare his chariot and go down before the rain stopped him. Soon the sky grew dark with clouds and wind, and a heavy rain fell. The hand of the Lord was upon Elijah, and he tucked his cloak into his belt and ran ahead of Ahab all the way to Jezreel. But the victory at Carmel was followed by a moment of deep despair. As we read in 1 Kings 19:1-4, when Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword, Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, vowing that by the next day he would be like one of those prophets. Elijah was afraid and fled to save his life. He went to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, left his servant there, and traveled a day's journey into the wilderness. He sat under a broom tree and prayed that he might die, saying, "It is enough. Now, O Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors." The Lord's care for his discouraged servant is touching. As recorded in 1 Kings 19:5-8, Elijah lay down and slept under a broom tree, when suddenly an angel touched him and said, "Arise and eat." He looked, and there by his head was a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate and drank, then lay down again. The angel of the Lord came a second time, touched him and said, "Arise and eat, because the journey will be too great for you." So he got up, ate and drank, and with the strength from that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. At Horeb, as told in 1 Kings 19:9-14, Elijah entered a cave and spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to him, asking what he was doing there. He replied that he had been very zealous for the Lord, because the children of Israel had abandoned the Lord's covenant, torn down his altars, and killed his prophets with the sword. He alone was left, and now they sought to take his life. The Lord told him to go out and stand on the mountain before him. A great and mighty wind tore through the mountains and shattered the rocks, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind came an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire there was a still, small voice. When Elijah heard it, he covered his face with his cloak, went out, and stood at the entrance of the cave. In the cave on Mount Horeb, the Lord renewed Elijah's mission. As recorded in 1 Kings 19:15-18, God sent him back on his way to the wilderness of Damascus with 3 specific tasks: to anoint Hazael as king of Syria, Jehu son of Nimshi as king of Israel, and Elisha son of Shaphat as his prophetic successor. The Lord declared that whoever escaped the sword of Hazael, Jehu would kill, and whoever escaped the sword of Jehu, Elisha would kill. But God also revealed something comforting. He had preserved in Israel 7,000 people who had not bowed to Baal or kissed him. Elisha's calling is described in 1 Kings 19:19-21. Elijah found Elisha plowing with 12 pairs of oxen before him, and he was with the last pair. Elijah passed by him and threw his cloak over him, a symbolic gesture of transferring prophetic authority. Elisha left the oxen, ran after Elijah, and asked to bid farewell to his parents. Then he returned, took a pair of oxen, slaughtered them, and used the oxen's equipment to cook their meat, giving it to the people to eat. Then he arose, followed Elijah, and served him. Meanwhile, a new threat arose against Israel. As recorded in 1 Kings 21:6, Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, gathered his entire army, along with 32 kings, horses, and chariots, and went up, besieging Samaria and waging war against it. He sent messengers to Ahab, king of Israel, inside the city, demanding his silver, gold, wives, and most handsome children. Ahab initially agreed, but when Ben-Hadad also demanded the right to search the palace and the houses of his servants, taking whatever was valuable, Ahab refused after consulting with the elders. Ben-Hadad's response was menacing. As we read in 1 Kings 20:10-11, he swore that the dust of Samaria would not be enough to fill the hands of all his men. Ahab wisely replied, "Tell him, let not the one who puts on his armor boast like the one who takes it off." This answer enraged Ben-Hadad, who then ordered the attack on the city. At this critical moment, as recorded in 1 Kings 20:13-15, a prophet approached Ahab and said, "Thus says the Lord, do you see this great multitude? Behold, today I will deliver them into your hand, so that you may know that I am the Lord." When Ahab asked by whom the victory would come, the prophet answered that it would be by the young men of the provincial leaders. Ahab then gathered the young men of the provincial leaders, 232 in total, and after that, the rest of the army, 7,000 Israelites. The battle that followed was an overwhelming victory for Israel. As recorded in 1 Kings 20:16-21, they set out at noon while Ben-Hadad was drinking and getting drunk in the tents, along with the 32 kings who supported him. The young men of the provincial leaders went out first. Ben-Hadad was informed that men had come out from Samaria, and he ordered them to be taken alive, whether they came in peace or for war. But the young men of the provincial leaders and the army that followed them struck down their opponents. The Syrians fled, and Israel pursued them. Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, escaped on horseback with some horsemen. The king of Israel attacked, struck down the horses and chariots, and inflicted a great defeat upon the Syrians. The prophet warned Ahab to strengthen himself, because the king of Syria would attack again the following year. As we read in 1 Kings 20:23-25, the servants of the king of Syria told him that the gods of Israel were gods of the mountains, which was why they had been stronger. They suggested that if they fought Israel in the plains, they would surely be stronger. They also advised removing the kings from their positions and replacing them with captains, as well as rebuilding the lost army. The second battle took place at Aphek. As recorded in 1 Kings 20:26-30, the Syrians positioned themselves at Aphek for battle. The Israelites, having received supplies, went out to meet them. They camped opposite them, looking like 2 small flocks of goats, while the Syrians filled the land. The man of God warned Ahab that because the Syrians had said the Lord was the God of the mountains and not of the valleys, he would deliver the entire great multitude into Israel's hands. After 7 days of waiting, the battle began, and in a single day, the Israelites killed 100,000 Syrian infantrymen. The remaining soldiers fled to Aphek, where a wall collapsed on 27,000 of them. Ben-Hadad, who had fled to the city, hid himself in an inner chamber. As we read in 1 Kings 20:31-34, his servants told him that the kings of Israel's house were merciful kings. They dressed in sackcloth, put ropes on their heads, and went to the king of Israel, pleading for Ben-Hadad's life to be spared. Ahab not only spared him, but also called him his brother and made a covenant with him, allowing him to establish bazaars in Damascus, just as his father had done in Samaria. This undue mercy toward a declared enemy of Israel would have consequences. As we read in 1 Kings 20:35-43, one of the sons of the prophets, by the word of the Lord, asked his companion to strike him, but the man refused. Because he disobeyed the Lord's command, a lion killed him. The prophet then asked another man to strike him, and this man struck and wounded him. The prophet disguised himself with a bandage over his eyes and waited for the king on the road. When Ahab passed by, the prophet told a parable about a prisoner who had escaped under his watch, and the king pronounced judgment. His life would be taken in place of the prisoner's. Then the prophet removed the bandage from his eyes, and Ahab recognized him as one of the prophets. The message was clear. Because he had let go of the man whom the Lord had devoted to destruction, his life would be taken for the life of that man, and his people for the people of that man. Following these events, an episode would further reveal the corrupt nature of Ahab and Jezebel. As recorded in 1 Kings 21:1-4, Naboth the Jezreelite had a vineyard in Jezreel next to Ahab's palace. The king proposed buying it or exchanging it for a better one, but Naboth refused, saying, "The Lord forbid that I should give you my ancestors' inheritance." Ahab returned home resentful and sullen, lay down on his bed, turned his face away and refused to eat. Seeing her husband in this state, as we read in 1 Kings 21:5-16, Jezebel asked him why he was so upset. When she learned the reason, she said, "Do you now govern the kingdom of Israel? Get up, eat, and cheer up. I will give you Naboth's vineyard." She wrote letters in Ahab's name, sealed them with his signet, and sent them to the elders and nobles of the city. In the letters, she ordered them to proclaim a fast, set Naboth before the people, and have 2 false witnesses accuse him of blaspheming against God and the king. This was done, and Naboth was stoned to death. When Jezebel heard that Naboth was dead, she told Ahab to take possession of the vineyard that Naboth had refused to sell. Divine judgment came through Elijah. As we read in 1 Kings 21:17-24, the Lord commanded the prophet to meet Ahab in Naboth's vineyard and declare, "Thus says the Lord, have you killed and also taken possession? In the place where the dogs licked up Naboth's blood, they shall lick up your own blood." Ahab said to Elijah, "Have you found me, my enemy?" And he replied, "I have found you because you have sold yourself to do what is evil in the sight of the Lord." The judgment would be severe. The Lord would bring disaster upon Ahab, cutting off all his male descendants, both free and slave. In Israel, his house would be like that of Jeroboam and Baasha, because he had provoked the Lord and led Israel into sin. Concerning Jezebel, the Lord declared that dogs would devour her by the wall of Jezreel. Surprisingly, as recorded in 1 Kings 21:25-29, when Ahab heard these words, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, fasted, and walked humbly. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, saying that because Ahab had humbled himself, the disaster would not come in his days, but in the days of his son. Ahab's story was nearing its end. As we read in 1 Kings 22:1-4, after 3 years without war between Syria and Israel, Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, went down to visit the king of Israel. Ahab proposed that they go together to recover Ramoth Gilead from the king of Syria. Jehoshaphat agreed, saying, I am as you are, my people as your people, my horses as your horses." However, Jehoshaphat asked that they first inquire of the Lord. As recorded in 1 Kings 22, 5-12, Ahab gathered about 400 prophets and asked whether he should go against Ramoth-Gilead. They answered affirmatively, but Jehoshaphat asked if there was still another prophet of the Lord to consult. Ahab admitted that there was one more, Micaiah, son of Imlah, but that he hated him because he never prophesied anything good about him, only evil. The confrontation between the false prophets and Micaiah is dramatic. As we read in 1 Kings 22, 13-28, when the messenger went to summon Micaiah, he urged him to agree with the other prophets and predict success. Micaiah replied, "As the Lord lives, I will say whatever the Lord tells me." Initially, he sarcastically repeated what the other prophets had said, but when Ahab commanded him to speak only the truth in the name of the Lord, Micaiah revealed his vision. He saw all Israel scattered on the mountains like sheep without a shepherd. He explained that he had seen the Lord on his throne with the heavenly host around him, and a spirit had volunteered to be a lying spirit in the mouths of Ahab's prophets. Zedekiah, son of Chenaanah, struck Micaiah on the cheek and questioned when the Spirit of the Lord had left him to speak to Micaiah. Micaiah responded that he would know on the day he fled into an inner chamber to hide. Ahab ordered Micaiah to be thrown into prison and fed only bread and water of affliction until he returned safely. Micaiah replied, "If you return safely, then the Lord has not spoken through me." And he added, "Hear this, all you people." The battle at Ramoth-Gilead would be fatal for Ahab. As we read in 1 Kings 22, 29-40, he devised a plan to disguise himself for battle while Jehoshaphat wore his royal robes. The king of Syria had commanded the captains of his chariots to fight only against the king of Israel. When they saw Jehoshaphat, they thought he was the king of Israel, but when he cried out, they realized he was not Ahab. However, a man randomly shot an arrow, and it struck Ahab between the joints of his armor. The king was propped up in his chariot against the Syrians, and he died at sunset. The blood from his wound flowed to the bottom of the chariot. By evening, a proclamation went out through the army: "Every man to his city and every man to his own land." They washed the chariot at the pool of Samaria, where the prostitutes bathed, and dogs licked up his blood, according to the word of the Lord. Jehoshaphat was 35 years old when he began to reign, and he ruled for 25 years in Jerusalem. As recorded in 1 Kings 22, 41-50, he walked in all the ways of Asa, his father, not turning aside from them, doing what was right in the eyes of the Lord. However, the high places were not removed. The people still sacrificed and burned incense on them. Jehoshaphat also made peace with the king of Israel. The rest of Jehoshaphat's deeds, the power he displayed, and how he waged war are written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah. He also expelled from the land the remaining cultic Sodomites who had persisted since the days of his father Asa. At that time, there was no king in Edom, only a governor. Jehoshaphat built ships of Tarshish to go to Ophir for gold, but they never set sail because the ships were wrecked at Ezion-Geber. Then Ahaziah, son of Ahab, said to Jehoshaphat, "Let my servants sail with your servants in the ships." But Jehoshaphat refused. In Israel, as recorded in 1 Kings 22, 51-53, Ahaziah, son of Ahab, began to reign over Israel in Samaria in the 17th year of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, and he ruled over Israel for 2 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, walking in the ways of his father, his mother, and Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who had caused Israel to sin. He served Baal, worshipped him, and provoked the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger, just as his father had done. Thus the first book of Kings ends, showing the contrast between the kings who followed the Lord and those who turned away from him. The story would continue in the second book of Kings, providing more examples of how the choices of leaders profoundly affected the fate of their nations, and how faithfulness or unfaithfulness to God brought direct consequences upon the people of Israel. And so we come to the end of this incredible journey through the first book of Kings, a narrative that shows us how wisdom can turn into folly, how power can corrupt even the wisest of men, and how God remains faithful even when his people stray. If you were moved by these stories of rise and fall, of courageous prophets and kings faced with difficult choices, share this video with someone who might also benefit from these valuable lessons. Every story in the Book of Kings teaches us something about leadership, faithfulness, and the consequences of our choices. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, this is the perfect time to join our community. We have more fascinating biblical series planned, including the continuation of this story in the second book of Kings. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any episode. Let us know in the comments which part of this story impacted you the most. Was it Solomon's wisdom, Elijah's courage on Mount Carmel, or perhaps the consequences of Rehoboam's decisions? Your participation enriches our discussion and helps us create even better content. Thank you so much for following along. See you in the next video.